And so for some people, this is really more than they want to pay. And particularly people who like to have new cars frequently might consider an auto lease. So leasing rather than buying is an option for some people. Often it is a lower car payment, and the trade-off though is that at the end of the lease, you don't own the car. So it's kind of like renting an apartment. When your lease is up, you don't own any of that property. You just have to vacate the property. So the advantage to a lease is that it is a lower monthly payment. You don't have to pay for that depreciation. So that is part of what you're not having to pay for. But what this lease is being based on is the residual value. So they calculate how much they think the car is going to be worth at the end of this term. And it's typically between 40 and 60% of the retail price, depending on the type of the lease. So you have a few things that you have to consider with these leases. One of those things is just the payment, and it's often called the net capitalized cost, the money factor, the average monthly finance charge, and the average monthly depreciation. So all of those things go into these monthly lease payments, because certainly the car dealership is not planning on losing any money on these leases. So they take all of these things into consideration. So what these are, the net capitalized cost is the negotiated price minus the down payment minus the trade-in value. Your money factor is where you take the annual interest rate, divide that by 2,400. That's just the way this is calculated. And then the average monthly finance charge is where you take the net capitalized cost plus the residual value and multiply by the money factor. And then your average monthly depreciation, you take that net capitalized cost minus the residual value divided by the number of months in a lease. So you can see that there's an awful lot of things that go into this calculation. Now, when you go to lease a car, you're just going to sign on the dotted line. They'll have all of this worked out for you, but it is helpful for you to know where it's coming from. So the monthly lease payment is coming from basically the average monthly finance charge and the average monthly depreciation. That's what you're paying for when you lease a car. Now we can go through an example of how to calculate all of these things. So if you had a director of a human resources for a company decides to lease a car for 30 months, there's your interest rate, your negotiated price. There's not going to be a trade-in if there's not a car. So in this example, she doesn't have a car to trade in, and there is a down payment. Now here we are going to assume the residual value at 55% and an MSRP of $33,400. So you notice that the retail price of the car and the negotiated price of the car, there is a difference there. If we want to go through all of these calculations, we just use those formulas. The net capitalized cost is that negotiated price minus the down payment minus any trade-in value. Sometimes the first lease that people have, they did have a car that they own, and so they might have a car to trade in. But once you've leased for a little while, you'll no longer have a car to trade in. So there'll often be no trade-in value. So here, our net capitalized cost is $24,500. Our residual value, you take your MSRP times that percentage, which was 55 in this case. So that residual value is $18,370. And so here, if we take our net capitalized cost plus the residual value times the money factor, which we knew was that interest rate divided by 2,400, we can calculate the monthly finance charge, which you'll see here is $150, and it'll round to 5 cents. So a few more things that we have to calculate here. It's quite complicated, but we need to take the net capitalized cost minus the residual value divided by the number of months in the lease. And when we do that calculation, we get $204.33. So that's the average monthly depreciation. And the payment that you pay for a lease is the finance charge and this depreciation. So when a monthly lease payment was given to you as $354.38, that's how they calculated that for the finance charge and the depreciation. So at the end of a lease, you don't own anything. So you basically have just paid for the privilege to drive this car. So why do people lease? Well, some of the advantages here is often the down payment is not as large, so you can get into a car quicker. It does depend on the leasing company. And then one of the major advantages for people is after 3 or 4 years, you can go get a new car. If you are financing a car, you probably don't want to do that. You probably are going to drive the car a little bit longer than 3 or 4 years. And often you'll have a lower maintenance cost because the lease time is in that beginning of the car life. It's under warranty, and new cars typically don't have a lot of things that they need for regular maintenance. Now, there are some disadvantages. You don't own the car, so you cannot make any changes. You can't do any customization. It's not your car. And there are typically some mileage restrictions. So if you drive a lot, that's going to be an additional cost. So you need to consider that if you are doing a lot of driving. And leasing can be more expensive. So you have to think, how long do you want to keep a car? So if you're going to keep a car for 6 years, it may be cheaper to just straight out purchase a car. But if you are going to want to drive a car for a smaller amount of time, 3 years, then you would lease. So you have to decide what works for your finances and what works for your personal preferences. One advantage here is that you do get a new car a lot more frequently. You are going to end up spending more money if you continually lease. Now, there is one thing to pay attention to. If you don't like the car or you want to get another one before the end of your lease, there can also often be a big cost with terminating that lease. So what are some of the advantages and disadvantages of buying the car? Well, if you buy the car, it's yours. You can make changes to it. You can drive it as much as you want. You can sell it at any point. And typically, if you're planning on keeping the car for at least 6 years, it's cheaper to buy a car. But there are some disadvantages. You have a large down payment. The car is going to depreciate. We saw that it's about 10% the second you drive it off of the lot. Typically, payments for a car are higher than lease payments. And if you keep your car past the warranty period, which is anywhere from about 3, 5 to even 10 years for certain things, you have to pay for any repairs past that warranty period. So there's a lot of considerations when you are deciding whether or not to buy or lease a car. And there's a lot of considerations just with how these different costs are in terms of, owning a car or leasing a car.